She was pregnant by her own grandson. At 52, she gave birth to a healthy baby, and suddenly the word grandmother no longer made sense. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And stay, because this story doesn't end with a confession. It ends with a chart. In the spring of 2019, when most women her age were quietly adjusting to empty bedrooms and retirement plans, Margaret H., a 52-year-old former real estate administrator living in a quiet suburban development outside Phoenix, did something no one around her expected. She announced her pregnancy. It wasn't dramatic. There was no social media spectacle, no ultrasound posted with hashtags. Instead, the news spread the old way, through whispered phone calls and stiff congratulations at backyard gatherings. Margaret had always been private, almost guarded, and now that privacy hardened into something else entirely. She wore loose clothing, avoided prolonged conversations, and when people asked questions, she answered with carefully chosen medical language. IVF, donor egg, high risk, doctor approved. Her husband, Daniel, stood beside her in every explanation, nodding, silent, loyal. To the outside world, the story was simple. Science had given them a second chance. But from the beginning, something about the timing unsettled those closest to them. Margaret had never once mentioned fertility treatments before. No one remembered clinic visits, hormone injections, or the emotional exhaustion that usually comes with years of trying. The pregnancy appeared almost suddenly, as if it had arrived fully formed, without the struggle people expect to see. And yet, doctors confirmed it. Medical paperwork existed. Insurance claims were filed. A healthy baby boy was born that winter, premature but strong, greeted with cautious celebration and restrained joy. Margaret named him quietly, held him tightly, and retreated further inward. What no one knew, not even Daniel, was that the embryo implanted in her body was not the one she had consented to receive. Somewhere between frozen storage tanks and electronic records, a substitution had occurred. Whether it was negligence, fraud, or something more deliberate would not be questioned for years. And during those years, a child grew up believing he belonged exactly where he was born, while a woman carried a secret she didn't yet understand. One that would eventually collapse not just her family, but an entire medical institution. By the time the baby was 6 months old, the house had settled into a rhythm that looked peaceful from the outside, but felt strained beneath every surface. Late at night, after the nursery light was switched off and the sound machine hummed softly behind a closed door, Margaret and Daniel would sit together in the living room, the television muted, the room lit only by the glow of a single lamp. It was during these hours that something in Margaret shifted. She became unusually affectionate, not warm in the familiar married way, but intent, almost deliberate. She would sit closer than she used to, her hand resting on Daniel's knee longer than necessary, her body angled toward him with a focus that felt rehearsed. When she kissed him, it wasn't rushed or distracted like it had been in the years before the pregnancy. It was slow, lingering. Her lips stayed just a second too long. Her eyes remained closed even after his opened. Daniel noticed it, but he didn't question it. He assumed it was gratitude, relief, the aftershock of surviving a high-risk pregnancy together. What he didn't notice was the tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing changed afterward, shallow and controlled, as if she were holding something back. On one particular night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Margaret leaned in and kissed him again. Deeper this time, with an intensity that startled him. For a brief moment, Daniel pulled back, searching her face, but Margaret smiled quickly and pressed her forehead against his, whispering that she was just happy, just thankful, just afraid that time was running out for them. Daniel accepted the explanation because it was easier than questioning it. But what Margaret felt in those moments was not gratitude, it was reassurance. Each kiss was a quiet test, a way of grounding herself in something familiar while an unnamed discomfort gnawed at her. In the days that followed, she became more withdrawn during daylight hours, avoiding mirrors, avoiding the baby's reflection in the glass of framed photos. At night, however, the intimacy continued, careful, contained, never crossing into overt passion, but charged enough to leave. Daniel uneasy in a way he couldn't articulate. He began to sense that the affection wasn't about closeness at all. It was about confirmation, about anchoring herself to a version of reality she desperately needed to remain intact. The doubt did not arrive dramatically. It slipped in quietly, disguised as routine. When the pediatrician suggested a comprehensive genetic screening, standard, precautionary, nothing alarming, Margaret felt a sharp, involuntary tightening in her chest that she could not explain. She nodded, smiled, signed the consent forms with steady hands, and told herself that every new parent felt this way. The sample was taken, the paperwork filed, and life resumed its careful rhythm. Weeks passed. Then an envelope arrived from the clinic, heavier than it should have been, its return address printed in sterile blue ink. Margaret opened it alone at the kitchen counter, the house silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. The first page was unreadable to her at first, percentages, markers, technical language, until her eyes locked onto a line that made the room tilt slightly. No genetic match to listed maternal donor. She read it again, slower this time, then a third time, pressing the paper flat with her palm as if it might change under pressure. Her mouth went dry. The report did not accuse. It did not explain. It simply stated a biological fact that did not fit inside the story she had been living. Over the following days, Margaret made phone calls she never mentioned to Daniel. She requested records. She asked for confirmations. She used calm, precise language, the kind people trust. What she received in return were delays, polite deflections, and finally, a corrected file that arrived with no apology attached. The embryo implanted during her IVF cycle had not come from the donor she and Daniel had selected. It had been mislabeled or reassigned during storage. The clinic framed it as a rare administrative error, statistically insignificant, deeply regretted. But the details in the margins told a different story: overwritten timestamps, altered consent codes, signatures that did not align. Margaret began waking before dawn, sitting in the dark, replaying moments she had dismissed. The lack of struggle, the sudden success, the ease with which the pregnancy had taken hold. When she looked at the child now, she saw not resemblance, but distance. Daniel sensed the change without understanding it. He found her staring at documents late at night, the papers stacked neatly, as if order could contain their meaning. When he asked what was wrong, Margaret told him only that the clinic had made a clerical mistake. She did not tell him whose biology the report suggested. She did not tell him how many people now existed between her family and the truth. The silence thickened, not with fear, but with something colder. The awareness that modern medicine, trusted and regulated, had quietly rewritten their lives without ever asking permission. The truth did not surface through confession or confrontation. It arrived the way modern betrayals often do, through metadata. A junior compliance officer at the fertility clinic, reviewing legacy cases after an unrelated lawsuit, noticed something that had been quietly normalized over years of internal shortcuts: a pattern of temporary custodial reassignment for viable embryos when primary donors withdrew or failed late-stage screenings. It was framed as ethical efficiency. Embryos already created, already paid for, already deemed healthy. The language was careful. The consent, however, was conditional, buried inside optional clauses no patient remembered signing. Margaret's case was one of several. but it was the only one where the reassigned embryo had been implanted into a woman old enough to trigger regulatory review. When Daniel finally learned the full scope, it wasn't from Margaret. It was from a letter addressed jointly to them, stamped confidential, informing them that the clinic was offering a settlement in exchange for silence. The attached file explained everything the clinic had avoided saying aloud. The embryo was biologically unrelated to Margaret, unrelated to Daniel, and had originated from a couple whose identities were protected by law, a couple who had never consented to parenthood beyond donation and who would never be notified. The twist was not betrayal between husband and wife. It was something more destabilizing. The child they were raising did not belong to any story that involved intention. No affair, no deception between partners, no hidden bloodline waiting to be revealed. The scandal was that the family had been manufactured by process, not choice, assembled through systems designed to optimize success rates, not human consequences. Margaret signed the settlement papers without hesitation. Daniel did not. He wanted names, accountability, explanation. Margaret wanted closure. In the end, the clinic rebranded, the officer was reassigned, and the case disappeared into sealed arbitration records. At home, nothing visibly changed. The child grew. The neighbors remained unaware. But the intimacy Margaret once used as reassurance never returned. She no longer needed confirmation from Daniel, because the fear had shifted. The child was healthy, loved, secure. And yet every time Margaret looked at him, she understood the final, unbearable truth of modern medicine. Sometimes the greatest scandal is not who the parents are, but that no one, at any point, was truly asked.